Okay, you're listening to the Infinite Imaginarium podcast. I'm your host, Meg Boardman, and with me today I've got Satori D, or also known as the Digital Showman. Are you there, Satori?
Yeah, I'm here. Hey, what's up?
And the Genius, hi. And we also have a special guest on today, uh, MICAH OFSTEDAHL, who, from what I've seen, is a bit of a master of creating some really wonderful art, which kind of shows all the intricate details and patterns that appear in our reality, sort of in nature and plants and anatomy, and cleverly combines it with a kind of surreal element. Um, and if you want to go and check out some of his artwork, you need to go to www.micahoffstedahl.com and check out this exquisite artwork. So, welcome, Micah. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us in the Imaginarium. You know, apologies for last week. I kind of hoped we'd be able to hook up, but as we had a few technical difficulties and stuff, we weren't able to do it. So, hopefully, today we can have a good chat. So, kind of my first question for you is what sparked you initially to begin the journey of sort of creating such wonderful paintings and with such intricate detail and everything that you've got going on in a painting. It's sort of like I had a look at a couple of your paintings and I had to keep zooming in and I kept seeing more and more stuff in it, and it was just so incredibly detailed.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I look back a lot and in over my life and try to see where this is all coming from. And I can pinpoint a lot of things. One big moment was when actually started painting again about 8 or 9 years ago. And I was looking for inspiration and came across an anatomy book, Gray's Anatomy. And it was just full of fairly simple illustrations, just black and white, not overly detailed of anatomy. And I was particularly drawn to the images that weren't very recognizable. Oftentimes they were microscopic, um, or very detailed cross sections. Really zooming in on the anatomy, like to the cellular level. Um, and just started painting for fun. I didn't really have much intentions or ideas at the time. Um, and just started taking bits and pieces and from that anatomy book and laying them on the canvas. And like I said, these images that I was using were fairly simple and just black and white. And I found that is the perfect source of inspiration for me. Doesn't where rather than using like microscopic photography with color and everything, and it's almost too much information. Um, so anyway, that was definitely a starting point. And ever since then, I've been painting these sort of. So it started with anatomy, like I said, and since then I've branched off into other biological forms for my sources of inspiration, and just kind of using bits and pieces and putting them oftentimes into a sort of a landscape format and um, putting a surreal twist to it.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of a flavour of the Dali in there. When you just glance at it, just very quickly, there's sort of that it kind of reminds me a little bit of some of the things that he's done. Just when I literally scan over some of your work, but then obviously when I go into it in a detail, it's actually not anything like Salvador Dali at all. It's a lot more technical, in a sense. Whereas his tended to be more blended together in many ways. He sort of had a surreal element, but then it'd be all blended in and merged together. But with yours, you kind of like zoom in, and there's just so much incredible detail. I mean, can you spend a lot of time on one painting, or how many hours would you spend on a painting? Is it something that you will just spend hours and hours and hours getting every single little detail, at a cellular level, sort of making
Yeah.
sure that you recreate that on the canvas?
Yeah, so I mean, every once in a while I do sort of try to keep track of my hours just out of curiosity and see what sort of pace I'm on. And like for example, I think an 18 by 24 painting that's inches took me 80 or 90 hours. And that would probably be like a month or maybe two, depending on how often I can get into the studio. So I usually keep track of it in that sense of how long it took me over weeks or months. And that, like I said, kind of depends on how often I get in the studio. But an average painting does take me probably a month or two. So I really only get about 6 or 7 paintings done over the course of a year. But I did start painting some smaller pieces um, just to have a little wider range. But yeah, like you mentioned Salvador Dali, and I think that was a good way to put it. That at first glance, it's very Dali-esque, and that's what a lot of people will say. That's definitely the first name that gets thrown around when people first see my work is Salvador Dali. Partially because he's probably the most well known, but also, I mean, there are definitely those similarities. But yeah, the subject matter is very different for sure. Um, and I do remember being influenced by Salvador Dali when I first came across his work. I think I was in high school, and I was just kind of blown away and was like, wow, that's definitely, I don't know, it just connected with me. So it was like already on that wavelength. But so there's definitely several moments throughout my life. I mentioned coming across that anatomy book when I actually started doing this style of painting. I got back into painting, and but I look back at several other moments well before that, even from childhood. I was probably 4 years old or so, coloring in coloring books, and I remember asking my parents for the whiteout when I would go outside of the lines in my coloring book. And so I can even look back at that and kind of laugh a little bit for one thing, but also see sort of where my perfectionism comes from. Um, and even now I still have that, and at least now I'm creating my own lines in my paintings, but I do have this tendency to want to really sort of go for perfection when creating those lines. But
What are your kind of main sources of inspiration, when you start a new project or a new piece of artwork? And do you have any kind of equipment or any way of kind of looking at something at very close range, like the zoom in quality, or is it just something that you source? You kind of have a subject matter, and then you source that, and then you look at pictures of a close up of that, or like super close up, so you can see all the details, and then is that part of your inspiration, or do you have another sort of way of sourcing information, or to inspire you to create new pieces?
right, well, yeah. So beyond that Grey's Anatomy book, like I mentioned, I've kind of going into other forms of biology and nature as well, and in fact, don't use anatomy a whole lot in recent paintings. Um, so like Ernest Haeckel, for example, um, is a great source of inspiration to me. He was a sort of scientist slash more of an illustrator, scientific illustrator, mid late 1800s, and there are books out of his work. One in particular that I use quite a bit is called Art Forms in Nature, and it's kind of similar to like that Gray's Anatomy book where I mentioned it has like black and white drawings. They're detailed, but they're also kind of simplified in a way. And his work is just really beautiful the way he does it. But it's just full of so many biological forms and patterns, and sometimes I don't even know what I'm looking at. But and that's not even really the point, because I'm not a scientific illustrator. It's just a good place for me to start and get some sort of like patterns or lines and shapes and textures and whatnot, just for a starting point, and sort of a visual inspiration. And I'll just take bits and pieces of that and kind of, well, first I'll start laying them down very quickly in a sketchbook, and don't spend a whole lot of time on my sketches. It's just to get sort of a general composition and the subject matter in there. And then I'll start painting, and that often changes throughout that process. But and other sources of inspiration would just be actual nature. I try to get out as much as possible, and that's definitely my biggest inspiration. Um, it's sometimes it's not always a direct inspiration, where I'll actually look at something and put that into a painting, but it's just inspiring to, to me as a person, and to my soul, and just energizes me. Um, and I'm always in awe by it, even just looking at a simple leaf, and looking at the vein structure in a leaf, or looking at a flower really closely, especially even just like a tiny flower that you might not think is anything very special, but then you look closely at it, and it's, if that flower was, say, 4 inches wide, it would be one of the more popular flowers out there because it's just so beautiful, but you would easily pass it by, but just because it's tiny. Um, and so I'm always just blown away by nature, and no matter how much time I spend on a painting, I could never even come close to what's going on inside of, even just a blade of grass. Because if you think about, you just looking at a blade of grass, it's not much, but the deeper you go into it and think about, down to the cellular level, and how it functions, and how it grows and reproduces and goes through this whole life process, and just think about how complex it really is, even though it looks so very simple on the surface at our level. Just if you were to look at it, you wouldn't think twice. But so I'm always just blown away by that, and that goes into my work. And I think that's partially why I try to put so much detail into my work, is to draw the viewer in more and more, and to appreciate looking closer at things and being drawn in. And there's like different levels to it. Hopefully you can enjoy it from afar, but go in closer and closer and you'll find more. And so that's another thing I think about is sort of infinity. You can infinitely small or infinitely large, for that matter. Space is just kind of all relative, but or size is all relative. All those things go into my work, and that's kind of where that surreal aspect comes from, is because there is so much mystery to life as well. Even that simple blade of grass might seem simple, but it's really so very complex.
Yeah, it brings something to mind actually that a lot of artists struggle with, and something that we all kind of have to learn. And I know that as an artist myself, I struggle with this a lot. And it's kind of it's that point when you think, right, that painting's done, I'm not going to do any more to it. And obviously we all have different styles of the way we do our artwork and different sources of inspiration. But that was one of the things I'd like to ask you, because your artwork is so detailed. That's a big part of what you do, is the detail. At what point do you sort of say to yourself, right, I've finished now, I'm done with that? Because like you say, you can, when you go closer and closer and closer and closer to something, you can keep on seeing more and more and more and more detail as you get closer and closer to it. And is kind of infinite. You know, it's kind of never ending. And I kind of thought, well, with your style of artwork, is that something that you struggle with? You know, thinking, right, I've put enough detail in this picture now. I've come to the end of this painting. You know, it's finished. At what point, you know, how do you measure coming to the end of something, or at what point do you think, right, that is finished? I was only interested to ask you that because obviously your work is so detailed.
Yeah, and that can be tricky. You know, as I mentioned, I do some sketches, and that lays out the general idea of where I'm going with it. But oftentimes that changes along the way, and oftentimes I find that it needs a little bit more. And I think partially because I'm usually painting quite a bit larger than my sketch, and so when you put it on that larger canvas, it just needs more to it. But it so sometimes it's when I get everything on the sketch and I kind of know what my end goal is. Other times, like I said, then I find that I need more, and then I'll just keep adding a little bit here and there until I think, okay, it's done. And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to explain. Sometimes I guess you just know when it's done. Um, I try not to actually overcomplicate my paintings too much, despite the detail. I put a lot of time into sort of perfecting what's there, but at the same time, trying not to put too much into it. So if you're looking at my website, for example, and if you picture that as like a, you know, larger painting, on one hand, some paintings you might think there's not even a whole lot going on. Um, but again, if you look closer, you'll see more detail, and it's I just don't want to like overcrowd the paintings too much. And so just rather than doing that, I sort of go for perfecting what's there. Um, on the other hand, some of my paintings do have a lot going on, but I guess that's all relative. But um, yeah, so I don't know. You just kind of know when it's done. And sometimes you just can't spend any more time on it and you just have to be done with it. But and thankfully it's not infinite as far as, you know, like I mentioned, like actual nature is infinite. Like you can look at the human body and keep going in further down to the cells, down to the molecules, down into the atoms, and go on forever, and the quarks and what makes up quarks. And it's like we may not even know what's beyond that because we cannot see that yet. Thankfully with painting, I can only go so far, and I don't bring out the magnifying glass or anything to get, you know, and that's kind of where I draw the line. I even try to sometimes catch myself zooming in way too much on the canvas when I'm just a few inches away, and I'm thinking no one's ever going to see this, so just back off a few more inches and don't worry so much about that fine of detail because you're kind of just wasting your time. So um, I try to draw the line somewhere with that.
And of course,
You know,
everybody's perception of the world around them, um, they have their own kind of mind map, as I call it, which determines what their perception of their external reality actually is. And this is the whole thing with art, is that people see different things. I mean, I've sort of been halfway through creating something, and somebody's come to my house and they've seen it and they've gone, "Oh my god, I love that!" And I say, "Yeah, but it's not finished yet. It's going to change next week. It'll be different." And they're going, "No, don't change it. To them, it's finished. To me, I'm still working on it, and sometimes I'm
yeah,
frustrated because I can't get to a certain point of where I want it to be. Somebody comes around and views it, and to them, their perception is telling them it's a completed piece of work, and they're saying to me, why would you even want to do anything more to that? It's perfect the way it is." And I'm thinking,
yeah,
no, it's just not finished yet. And I've also done pieces of work where I've completely ignored my intuition of, you know, like you rightly said, you sometimes just get a feeling, you know, I've sometimes ignored that feeling and I've gone on, and then I've kind of, in my view, in my perception, I've destroyed a piece of work. And I've quite often, I've created things and I've just completely whitewashed the whole thing and started again, because I'm thinking, no, I so I think sometimes
Yeah.
I should listen to those people when they come around and say, actually, that is finished, that looks really good. And I'm going, no, it needs more detail. It needs stuff. Quite often, those are the paintings that I've gone on to add more to, and then I've been really disappointed and wish I hadn't gone beyond that point. So it's a strange thing, but I would definitely agree with you in the sense that you do just get a feeling and you just know when something's finished and you don't want to add any more detail. And I think that's the same for most artists. But even if you're doing portraits, and you're doing a lot of detail on someone's face, you can kind of go a bit overboard with that if you're not careful as well. And then before you know it,
Right.
if you're working from a photograph and you're doing a portrait as a commission or something, the tiniest detail will totally transform somebody's face. And it's the
Yeah.
same with any painting. The tiniest detail will transform it and take it to another level. It might not necessarily be the level you want to go to. So obviously with portrait, if you're trying to get an exact likeness and then you add one different shadow or one line wrinkle, then the person's face is completely different. It takes on a completely different appearance just from that tiny detail.
Yeah.
So it depends on the type of art you're doing. Obviously, there's certain artwork, like with the type of artwork that you do, if you were to add another detail, then yes, it would take on another it would add another dimension to the painting, but it wouldn't necessarily matter. But with something, when you're trying to get pinpoint accuracy with a facial expression, adding that extra detail could be a nightmare, because then the
Yeah.
face is completely different. Then when I've done that, I've been doing portraits over the years, and I've added extra detail that I hadn't meant to initially, and then I've had to start all over again because I've just completely changed the look of someone's face. It's just not accurate. Perhaps certain people wouldn't notice those tiny details, but I think as the years go by, depending on how long you do artwork, you start to kind of get an eye for those details, and what somebody else might not notice, you notice it. And I think other artists would probably notice too, because they've got that kind of ability to see things in such rapid detail. It's just something you develop, I think, over the years. But
Mm-hmm.
that was why I was interested. But the next thing that I was going to say was that, in terms of the artwork that you do, it really kind of highlights the connectiveness of our reality. Like, for example, with the human eye, when you kind of zoom into that, it takes on a look of nebulas and things like that in space. It's got a very similar look to it. And I find that so many things in our reality that have these kind of patterns, um, there's obviously something there that connects everything together, because
Mm-hmm.
there seems to be these repeated patterns in things. Like there's elements of a tree when you cut through a tree and you look at sort of the inside of a log or something, it has certain patterns and similar things to the human anatomy, to the human being, and fruits, flowers, all the things that we find in our reality all have some kind of connection. So I think it's very interesting, the art that you do, because it really highlights that connection that we have in our reality that I'm not sure everybody is aware of or thinks about.
Right.
I've mentioned this to people before, and they've never really some people just look at you blankly and they don't really know what you're talking about. So I was just wondering, in relation to your art, how you view the reality that we live in terms of all that connection.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. I'm glad you get that from looking at my work too. That's something that's kind of come along over the years. When I started painting, it wasn't necessarily something I had in mind, but that's something that I have noticed developing in my work as well. And sometimes I feel like I am just another viewer of my work because I don't often go in with the concept in mind ahead of time. I just start doing and often look back at it and continue to learn about it. Even paintings I did years ago, I'll start to see patterns and things. And so, yes, that connection to nature and other patterns in nature, not just connection of humans to the rest of nature, but all the connections throughout nature, and seeing the patterns and similarities, because we do have to remember that we are part of nature, and sometimes we view ourselves as being very separate from nature. And I see where that comes from, because in some ways we are a very unique species, and do a lot of things differently than any other species. But and so that's definitely part of what my work is about, is that connection to nature. But sometimes I do throw in that separation from nature too. Every once in a while, you'll see more man-made looking structures in my work. But yes, going back to the some of the patterns in nature, like a branching pattern or networking pattern is something I've found that appears in my work quite a bit. And you see that at so many different levels, in trees, obviously, but not just the trunk to the branches, but then down to the leaves and the veins in the leaves, and it keeps going. And like the word fractals comes to mind there. But also you see that same pattern in the veins and capillaries of us and other animals. You see that pattern in rivers and streams. And there's something, not just do you see that pattern, but there's also something very symbolic about the pattern too, because it's always carrying something. There's a source in it, and whatever's in that, whether it's the blood in the veins or the water in the rivers, or the water and nutrients flowing through a plant, it's like giving life. It is life. So it's obviously a very important part of life, and so that plays a symbolic role in many ways in my work, and that's just one of the patterns that you'll see in nature. And the more I do this, the more I see those connections, and it does kind of bring me closer, to the natural world.
I think your art, is very significant at the time, the time we're living through at the moment, because everything in society, and it has been for sort of hundreds of years, is so divisive.
Yeah.
Everything that is, forced, rammed down our throats. We're indoctrinated from a very young age through the various institutions to have these kind of separate identities. Right from the beginning, the minute we're born, we have a birth certificate and we identify as whoever. Our parents give us a name, and then that becomes our identity. We are that person, and then after that, subsequently, everything that we are taught, everything that we're sort of programmed to believe is the right way of existing in life, becomes quite divisive, and there becomes a lot of kind of labels and groups, whether it's religion or class system. And yet you look at reality, the reality that we actually exist in, and it's completely connected and not divisive at all. And as I said before, it surprises me how many people, I've sort of said this to a few people. I've said, have you ever noticed, this pattern in nature, or, the pattern in this shell, or whatever. And then it's very similar to the pattern, a part of the human anatomy. And a lot of people, which I find quite surprising, have never thought about it, that it's never occurred to them. They've never noticed these connections. And I think the great thing about your artwork is that people who are not consciously aware just looking at your artwork would have a very profound effect on their subconscious mind, and it would help to expand their consciousness and their level of awareness. And that was one of the reasons why I was so interested to get you on the show, because I felt that, you know, I haven't come across an artist in recent times that has such an amazing way of creating something that would benefit people just by looking at it. I think all artwork is beneficial for people to just to look at it. You know, because we connect with it. You know, our brains connect with whatever the artist was feeling at the time. You know, it's that empathetic resonance thing. You know, when you look at artwork, and it immediately allows you to connect with the essence of what the artist was feeling or experiencing when they were painting that picture, sort of unbeknown to many people, but that's what happens. A bit like a mirror. And so I feel like your artwork is amazing in that respect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Go
Just
ahead.
to kind of like touch on that, because this is something too that I got from your paintings, and also too, I love when even in my own experience of viewing your art, I see these connections of whatever I'm kind of like reading or thinking at the time. And I was reading this article, and it was of this other artist, and he says, when he was talking about his role as an artist, he thinks that the role of the artist throughout history is to remind people of what life is about, because people tend to forget everything, and we get in these situations of our humdrum life, and how bad the planet is, and people start to live in this kind of hell, which is like this detachment from nature. And that, you know, what you were saying about you just walking out in nature and seeing that blade of grass or whatever. Not too long ago, I had this experience of I had like something in my eye that was like bugging me, and then so I went into the bathroom, and then I was trying to get the thing out of the eye. But then after I stopped focusing on, I think it was like an eyelash in my eye, and I got it out of my eye. Then I started to focus in on my actual eye, and I was like, oh shit, look at all the whole geometric patterns of it. And then I could see a slight reflection of myself in it, and how it goes, that infinite of that loop, you know? Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of this scene that I like when I was little, and you watch Men in Black, and it has, I think it's the closing scene of a galaxy, and it's all in this like marble. And I think that's something, you know, that even what like good art or whatever we tend to forget. And that what you're saying, like you kind of like view your own artwork, and I the more I talk to different artists, everybody has this similar experience. And I phrase it, because I do more poetry. I said that I have this experience that I'm just the pen, that like I'm the one like viewing myself doing it third person, and I think, whoa, that's kind of cool. Like in those little grooves, and you might not even fully realize it yet, but like later, like you said, you look at it and you see that connection, and this whole kind of fractal nature of everything. And I think that those moments is what like life is all about. Life is all about like this infinite beauty that is in every single moment of our awareness, and that we kind of like forget, because, you know, we have bills to pay, and different things that alert us and ping us throughout different things. So it's just something that I kind of wanted to throw out there, and express of my own experience of your artwork, but also connecting to my own thing that I'm always kind of playing with or mulling over in my own head, you know?
Yeah.
My view is that life is basically like a series of moments, sort of now moments. And we store, you know, the human biocomputer, the brain stores these moments in a certain part of the brain. And then we kind of reconnect with them as a memory, or we call them a memory. But the way I see it is that we're always in this one moment, which is our consciousness and our awareness. And as we create whatever happens within that particular moment, we record it, and then we store it away in our brain, and then we call it the past, or, you know, we call it a memory. So yeah, you're literally living life, and it's just literally a series of moments, or a series of frames. And this is why I always say to people that dwell on the past, and they may have had, they've created moments that they didn't like, or things that have happened in their life, and they dwell on these past events that are very negative, and they torture themselves, and it causes all sorts of turmoil and stress and in their life, because they're constantly thinking about something that happened in the past. And I try and say to people, but that was just the recorded moment of your life, that you can stand as you know, within the third person perspective. You can look at it and say, okay, that was something I created, but it no longer exists. I can now overwrite that past event that is causing me all this pain, by creating something new, by creating a new now moment. Sort of every time we go to sleep at night, we can say to ourselves, right, we're going to shift into a new reality. So whatever I created in the past and recorded and stored in my human computer, I can now make, if I want to, I can delete that. I can make it obsolete so it doesn't exist anymore. There might be things that you don't want to make obsolete. There might be things that you've created in your life that you want to keep stored in your human computer. So you can go back to them and look at them once in a while and think, oh, that was nice when that happened. But there's other things that we don't like, or that hold us back, that cause us issues in our current now moment, if that makes sense. So I was sort of trying to say to people, you don't have to hold on to those things. You know, they're literally just stored data in your brain. You can create new experiences. And this is the other thing, is people tend to, in life, struggle with certain elements, and they keep going around in a loop. And I said to somebody the other day that if you built a series of roads, you know, there were only so many roads that you could go down, you would eventually end up at the same point over and over again. You'd never move on. In the brain, the only way to create new neural pathways is by doing things that you wouldn't normally do. You know, so you create new things, you create new neural pathways, hence you create new roads, which then take you to a different point. So what I'm saying is, if you've only created something up to a certain point, so many roads, if you keep going around in a circuit on these roads, eventually you're going to end up in the same spot. You know, you're never going to move on, you're never going to change your life or do anything different. If you step out of your comfort zone and you try something different, which usually requires some kind of temporary discomfort, because obviously when people step out of their comfort zone and they do something different, it creates some kind of anxiety or fear. So it's kind of like you have to deliberately force yourself, which sounds a bit morbid in a way, to do something that you wouldn't normally do, something that will cause you a little bit of fear or stress, take you out of your comfort zone. And then you create this new neural pathway, a new road, and then you start to build this whole new circuit. So then the old circuit becomes obsolete as a result. It no longer exists. So you will no longer go around on that same loop. And I think art has a massive part to play in that it triggers new parts of the brain, and creates another connection where they can create a new road. This is why I think art is such an important thing, and partly why myself and Dan created this platform, because we thought there's thousands and thousands of amazing artists in the world, and nobody knows that they exist. Nobody knows about them. And it always really makes me sad that some of these really famous artists that are now deceased, when you go back and sort of look into the history, quite often these artists have had really poor lives, or they've had really stressful lives, and they only actually got any kind of acknowledgement for their artwork after they died. And then they became these kind of iconic people, like Vincent van Gogh, for an example, of a really sort of, well-known name that everybody has heard of. But he didn't have a very good life, and he only kind of became famous and acknowledged for his art. And his art was selling, not that it matters, but his art was selling for sort of ridiculous amounts of money after he died. And I kind of think, well, it would be better if we got to know who the artists were while they were still alive, and we could actually speak to them, and we had a record of how they came about to do, how they sort of stumbled upon the fact that they were doing the art, or that they enjoyed doing the art, and what their art means. And I think that helps people. But it's just kind of creating that new, again, as well, people are scared. There's a lot of people who are very creative and have a lot of to offer the world, and various gifts that they have, but they're too scared to express them because they're worried that people might not like it, or they'll end up with having a lot of negative critique on their work, whether they're a musician, an artist, painter artist, or they create music, or they sing, or they're a writer. There is something that puts you in a very vulnerable position, because you're kind of bearing your soul when you create a piece of artwork. It's kind of the essence of who you are, and you're then showing the world, you're showing the people this. I mean, it's like the ultimate dress down, isn't it? It's like, strip everything back, and this is who you are. So that would be kind of my view on the whole thing. I just feel that all artists, I have a huge amount of respect for them, because I think what they do is very brave in a way, that they would reveal. I mean, a lot of people say, well, why would you even be worried about revealing it? It's brilliant, but it's not necessarily the feeling of the person who's created that artwork. Somebody might really like your artwork, and it's so subjective, and another person would absolutely hate it. So it's very difficult to know what the response is going to be. And I think there's a lot of people still out there that haven't revealed themselves in that way, or they haven't shared that part of themselves yet.
Well, like you said, it's definitely revealing something about yourself to everybody who comes across it. So there is that vulnerability to it, and depending, again, kind of what sort of artwork you're doing, or like you said, it could be music or any form of art. But I think you just have to get over that and not worry about it for one thing. But and like you said, going back to creating the new neural pathways, or going down new roads. I mean, literally, when I take the back roads, using that analogy literally, is when I discover new things, a new trail to hike on, or a lake or something, that, new gems, and oftentimes have the most fun, rather than just doing the same thing over and over again.
It's definitely a case of stepping out of your comfort zone. And I think that makes me think of another thing as well, that there's this whole negative thing that surrounds people who suffer from depression. And obviously, a lot of artists suffer from depression, or they're bipolar, or there's some kind of issue there. And I think, again, depression is an opportunity for people to become introspective. And I think people that get depressed are sort of on the verge of looking at themselves in a much more introspective way. It may be that something has triggered it, so they have a major life-changing event, or some kind of a trauma that triggers the depression. And what usually happens when somebody suffers a severe trauma is it literally strips them down to sort of the bare bones essence of who they are. It takes away all the labels and identity that they once knew, and then they have to suddenly look at themselves a lot more closely. Sort of they're looking right into the mirror and seeing who they really are. And the awful thing is, people feel the need to suppress that, and they think it's a bad thing, and that depression needs to be treated with some kind of medicine from the doctor, antidepressants and things like that. And I actually think it's a process that should be explored, which sounds a bit strange. Why would anybody want to go deeper into their depression? But I think it's misjudged for what it actually is. I think it's something that all human beings go through at some point, because it's a point where you become more connected with who you are as a person. And a lot of people find that scary, because if it's a new experience for them, that they've never suffered depression before, that it feels scary, because they suddenly start, along with what is described as depression, they start to notice things a lot more about their reality and about themselves. And I think a lot of people find that quite scary. And I find that just doing art, creating art, I've had to, certain pieces of artwork that I've created, I've had to go into some really strange realms of my brain in order to create that work and create that artwork. And some of those things have been quite dark. Some of those places I've had to go to have been quite dark. And I think me and Dan did a show actually quite a while back now, all about the dark night of the soul, and that whole thing about going into those darker realms, or looking at things in a different light, which can be quite frightening. But if you go through kind of the pain barrier of that, things become a lot easier. You lose the fear of failure, the fear of something going wrong, the fear of people laughing at you, or for what you believe in. It kind of liberates you. So you have to kind of travel to that dark place in order to be liberated and come out, on top. If that makes sense. You come out feeling better. And you don't feel the need to conceal yourself anymore. You don't feel the need to be something other than who you really are, because through fear of losing your social status, or people thinking you're weird or whatever. But unfortunately, there has to be that pain barrier. And that's the same as, like I was saying, you have to go into new realms. You have to visit new places that you would never have thought of visiting before, that would normally be terrifying for you to think, well, I couldn't possibly do that because I don't know what the outcome is going to be. So it goes back to the comfort zone thing again. But yeah, as I said, I think your art's amazing in that respect, that the fact that your art is about connection, and I think that's part of the battle, is to come to that point of awareness that everything's connected, that we create things from our thoughts, from our consciousness, a bit like a projector at the cinema. Your mind is the projector, your consciousness is the projector, and then the pictures on the cinema screen are what you create as a result of what you're projecting. Whatever you believe in your conscious brain is almost like a request that is sent to the subconscious, and whatever is cultivated in the subconscious brain becomes the reality. And a lot of people think that's a bit cosmic and new age, but obviously when you go into quantum physics and you look at how everything works, how reality works, there's actually a science to it. And whatever you think and feel and believe becomes your reality. So I think that's what's brilliant about art, and yours in particular, because your artwork in particular highlights that connectivity in all things. So I think it would be very beneficial for people in the future to own a piece of your artwork and look at it daily, because it would help expand their individual consciousness.
Yes, thank you. And our reality is certainly like not just what we experience, but it's how we react to what we experience. So like you were kind of saying, we sort of create our own reality, and our reality is all like our memories and everything we've ever experienced, and but not just that we experienced, but how we experienced that experience, or in other words, like how we dealt with that experience or reacted to it. And um and so you are in control of that, or at least you can try to be as much as possible. You can't necessarily control what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it and learn from it. And even the negative experiences, like you're talking about earlier, you can let those go and move on from it. But you can also um, use those to your advantage. I mean, you don't want them to bog you down, but if you can learn from them and move on and say, oh, I don't want to go back there, or this is how I want to react to this negative thing, and sort of turn it into a positive. And like you were meant talking about depression, I think I'm not a depressed person. I don't have like clinical depression or anything. I mean, I've never been tested for anything like that, but I feel like I have been depressed at times, gone through. And I think the worst part about that is not really knowing why you're depressed. There's like nothing happened, nothing bad happened to me. So why do I feel bad? And it's just all in my head. And I think that's like the worst part about depression. And again, I'm just speaking for myself. I mean, I've heard a lot of other people say the same thing, but, and like you were saying too, you can turn that around and not view it as such a negative thing, because then it just makes it worse and you just get more depressed and you're depressed about being depressed, and it's like this downward spiral until you break out of it. But if you can turn that into a positive, and yeah, like you said, kind of welcome those dark places that you may go to. It's not that you want to be there, but try to turn that into a positive and not feel guilty about it. For me personally, I can usually listen to music or paint, and I might still be in that same headspace, but I feel okay about it. Like it doesn't bother me. It's harder, I think, when you have to deal with the outside reality. If you have to go to work that day and you're not in a good mood or you're depressed, that's when it seems to be harder to deal with or harder to function as a person. Um, but and that's the thing about art, is it allows you to go to those places and just be there and to just focus on something and create. And I feel very fortunate to be in that position. I mean, I still do work a part-time job to help, get by in this reality and pay the bills and things. But I'm cutting that down to 2 days a week now. Um, but anyway, so I even where I'm at now, I feel very fortunate to be there, to be able to spend a lot of time um, creating and going to those places in my head. Um, but I still think that's very important for everybody to be creative somehow, in some way. Not everybody's going to paint or crochet or make music or whatever, but there's so many different ways to do it, and it's a meditation in a lot of ways. So that's just another way you can just meditate, but to be able to relax for a little while and just be, and feel connected, and just kind of forget about um, the daily grind sometimes, because I think we get pretty easily sucked into that's our reality, is just work and television in the news. And yes, it's all real, but it doesn't have to be everything. And when we forget that there's this world out there that we're living in.
I think that's part of the problem as well, that people get depressed and they then say, I haven't got enough time to do the things that give me the most joy and the most pleasure. That's one of the big issues of people, is that they say, I haven't got enough time. How am I going to find, when am I going to find the time to do these things, these creative projects? And I've said to people in the past, if you're feeling that depression or that lack of satisfaction with the Groundhog Day scenario of life, which is part of what I was saying, that's part of the loop that they're on in their brain, that they've been partly sort of indoctrinated. They've created a looped program in their brain. So they go round and round in circles and they say, I haven't got enough time. I want to do X, Y, and Z, but I can't find the time to do it. And I just keep going round and round in circles. And the same thing keeps happening over and over again. And I say, well, if you've got to go to work the next day, you're going to be thinking, oh God, I've got to go to bed. I can't stay up all night and read this book that's really like drawing me in, and I'm finding it really interesting. And these are the times when people are depressed about their life and dissatisfied in some way. And they're going into the dark night of the soul. They're starting to have that feeling of, I just don't like my life the way it is. That's when they start to sort of notice things, and like they might read something and it really resonates with them, but then they'll suddenly think, I can't stay up and carry on reading this because it's now 2 o'clock in the morning and I've got to go to bed and I've got to go to work tomorrow. And I said, but that's the time when you just have to say, I don't care, I'm going to read this because something inside of me is saying read this, or research this. And I said, that's all part of creating another neural pathway, another road, a new road. When you create a new road, you will be able to come off that loop of Groundhog Day, of the repetitiveness that you feel trapped in. Because this is the feeling that people have. So many people have this feeling of being trapped. And if you say to them, well, why don't you try this or do that? They say, well, I can't because I haven't got enough time, or I've got to do this, or and I think that's where the depression stems from. The depression is almost like, you've got your lower self, your little self, which is like the ego part of the human, and then you've got your higher self, and your higher self will create a depression because it's kind of like saying you need to create a new road, a new direction. You need to create a new road that will ricochet you onto another path, and then you will be able to stop going around in this continual loop. But the problem is, because of the way people view depression as being a bad thing, rather than seeing it as a positive opportunity to change things, they think, right, I'm going to medicate myself. I'm going to go to the doctor, medicate myself, and then I'm going to carry on my usual path. So then they repeat the cycle, and then they become dissatisfied. And it's like people are always looking for stuff that's external from themselves to make things better. They think, oh, if I just had a little bit more money, I'd feel better. If I was married to a different person, I'd be better. If I didn't have that boss or that particular job, I'd be better. So they seek things outside of themselves to make things better. But then, of course, what they end up doing, because they haven't addressed the fact they're on this same continual loop, they then find themselves in another situation that's almost identical to the one they were in before. So if it was a situation with a job, they say, oh, I've got this terrible boss, I can't get on with them, I don't get on with any of the people in my job. They look for another job, they get a new job, and for a very small period of time they're happy, and then all of a sudden, like they're the most unlucky person in the whole world. All the exact same scenarios present themselves, but just in the form of different people, or a different location, different job. And then they feel that they're really unlucky person, and how, I can't believe it, I've got this new job, and then the same things happened again, because they haven't addressed that thing I was saying about creating the new road or doing something different. They haven't been able to step out of their comfort zone and try something new. But people eventually will get it, I think, and they'll realise that the power of changing something comes from within. I mean, it sounds like a real cliche. You hear that kind of thing all the time, but that really is the truth. It comes from, within the deep, dark recesses of your mind to change something. And, everything that has ever been created in this life has come from somebody's mind, it stems from a thought in somebody's brain. So, I think people have to sort of try and understand that, but it's not easy because there's so many distractions in life, and so many things to stimulate the senses, to ricochet us into so many different directions that we don't have a clear clarity of what path we want to travel. We constantly get distracted by things in our reality, usually through social media or the television, or it's very influential on the brain, and of course that then determines what the reality is.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because I was mentioning this before the show, but kind of going on with this whole taking a different path, and like, I guess in a simple phrase is, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. So I was talking about how just last week I broke my headphones, and at first I was like, I was a little pissed. My initial reaction was like, oh great, that's all I needed. Like, I have these projects that I want to do. I have to video edit some Are You Serious show, and then what about Imaginarium? And then I couldn't talk to Nikki when we had that show. And then I was just like, but the funny thing is that, so I was without my headphones, and then I was like, you know what? It's fine, whatever. And I always read, but like, that was like I couldn't do any video editing. I couldn't listen to music on my computer. And I was like, what do I do? And then so I busted out my small little record collection, and I put on some vinyl, and I just sat like writing. And then after a while, like the next day, it's like, oh, should I get the headphones? I was like, no, I got to finish reading this article. And then I had an idea to do this writing, and then I wrote like this poem. Then I had this idea for this short story, and then so the next day came. I was like, oh, should I go to the to go get headphones? I was like, you know what? No. I was like, oh, I'm gonna listen to more King Crimson. I was like, oh, I'm gonna read this. I'm gonna read that. And I literally didn't buy the headphones until Nikki reminded me that we had the show today, and I bought them like probably like 6 hours ago. And so like for more than a week, I just was like, I don't need the headphones. And I was just, it was just funny because like I just went with that mishap that happened and kind of just explored that road a little bit more, and just kind of went with it.
And it all worked. The minute you took the path of least resistance, it all came right.
Yeah, and it kept on spiraling more and more.
This is the thing. This whole thing about resistance is, when you resist something, you're actually kind of fueling the fire of the thing that you want to eradicate, or the obstacle that you want to overcome. When you have that feeling of frustration, and you're like, oh God, I've just got to do this. The minute you took the path of least resistance, it all came good for you. I think that's another thing that we could talk about probably in another show. But it's just that people are, that resistance to something actually is pouring energy into the very thing that you don't want anymore.
Yeah, definitely. Taking those negatives and turning them into positives again, and learning from them. And instead of thinking, oh, poor me, just think about what you can do in reaction to that. Or it's like your headphones Sorry, it reminds me of like when the power goes out or something. First you think, oh, what are we going to do now? We can't watch TV or whatnot. And so you kind of have to, all of a sudden, just 1 second you're doing one thing, and the next second you have to like think of something else to do. And it just kind of throws you out of your comfort zone. And it's a small thing. It's not a big deal, but it's just sort of symbolic. And it kind of forces you to maybe get a little bit creative and go down that new path.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. There's and it kind of came out of necessity. A couple years back, I'm a cook, so this restaurant that I helped open up, we didn't succeed, so it went down, and then so I was out of a job, and I was like, oh, okay. I don't know like how long. Well, I kind of was like, okay, I'm gonna use this time to kind of like milk it. That was like part of my deep dark secret. I was like, oh, okay, this is like an excuse for me to kind of like take a break, take a like a vacation, because I mean, especially opening up a restaurant. Like I was there, like I literally would wake up, go to the restaurant, come back exhausted, fall asleep, and repeat and repeat. And then the time that I did have a day off, it was what we call a work hangover, where it was literally like a hangover, and I would just sleep all day and feel really bad, and then go back and do it. And then so I was like, you know what? I was like, I have a little bit saved up, like, but I'm gonna like take away any expenses that I don't need. And so I was like, the cell phone bill's too much. I was like, you know what? I could go without a cell phone for a while. And I didn't. So I canceled my cell phone, and I didn't have a cell phone. And I know, I noticed like when I would go places with people, and just even like riding the bus, or just walking around, like I didn't have this thing to distract me easily, and I would just like overhear conversations, kind of like notice things more. It's like, oh, I kind of like this. So now I have a practice of like anytime I'm out with like friends or family at dinner, or a show or an event, I'm like, I'm not taking a cell phone at all. And I had this dream once where I was walking around, and it was like this old school arcade, and like this video game that used to be Cruising USA and things like that, where these kind of like these simulation games. But so in the dream, everybody was like tied in like VR goggles into this machine, and I was like trying to wake people up. And I had this dream like in college, so it was like 7 years ago or whatever. But it always sticks in my mind, and so now I still have this like same feeling, not all the time, but I mean, I remember going to with my family, my parents like baseball, and I used to play baseball when I was younger, so we'll go to the Dodger game, and I just like noticed that like everybody seems so glued to their phone, and I would just kind of like walk around, and I had the same eerie feeling that I had in that dream, and it's just something that I found that it worked for me, and it helped me to like stop and smell the roses. Because like when I was so tied into like work and so tied into that, like I forgot, because I remember there was a moment when I was with my sous chef, and we were just talking, and she said something about, this is all we know how to do, and it just like echoed in my head as this very depressing thing. I was like, this is not the only thing I know how to do. And it's not that like I'm interested in all sorts of things, but like it was just, I don't know, it was just a moment that stuck in my head, and that it's, I think one time, and of course you have to have a balance, like you were saying, there's actual necessity survival stuff that you need to do, but the thing that you're doing when you're procrastinating is probably the thing that you should be doing as like your calling for your life, you know? Like if it's like doodling while you're like waiting in a line, or is it that you take little notes, or is it that you like, you know, playing video games, or that you like, you know, really really watching a movie and you like analyze the scenes, or is it music? And I don't think there's any reason why, you know, what stops us from let's say exploring these different parts of ourselves is just that mental block of, well, I need, like, oh, I got work in the morning, I got this. I remember one time I told my friend, he calls me up, hey, I got some acid. I was like, oh, okay, cool. But that was the time that I was actually trying to start up this catering business. And I was like, I don't know, I got work in the morning. He's like, it's not, you know. I was like, I know I've done acid before. Like, I could physically do it, but mentally, I wouldn't want to do it. Like, I'm gonna like unlock the mysteries of the world, and then I'm gonna have to like chop vegetables the next day. Like, I could physically do it, but I'm not gonna want to. I'm gonna walk out and like yell at my chef that life's too short to do this mundane stuff, and he just started laughing. We ended up doing acid that night. I didn't quit my job that day, but it was just funny because that's like the thought that came into my head. I was like, I'm not gonna want to do it.
It's like sometimes you have these times when, you know, you may be with a group of people, and you're all having this great conversation. I remember this one time, well, this sort of thing used to happen all the time, actually, in my family. You know, me and my sister would be getting into this really great chat, and my mum would come along and she'd be like, right, you've got to go to bed now, you've got to go to school tomorrow, blah, blah. And we'd be having this really amazing chat. And we'd be like, no, but we just need to finish this conversation. And she'd sort of try and break it up. And she'd say, no, you've got to go. And quite often the linear part of the brain, you know, the organized part of the brain will take over and sort of try and say, no, you need to be disciplined, you need to stop this now. And I kind of think sometimes you need to ignore that. If something feels right at the time, you know, there's kind of there's a internal spark of energy to continue with something, but there's a part of your brain saying, no, you need to stop this now, you need to do such and such because you're going to be tired in the morning. A bit like the thing with what you were talking about, Dan, with taking the acid. I think if something's right, if you have that feeling of internal spark, everything will work out. So for example, if you were staying up late and you were having a discussion, you would still go to work the next day and feel strangely okay. It would be some kind of miracle, but you're like, it's really weird, I stayed up all night having that amazing conversation, which has created that new road in my brain, that new neural pathway. Yeah, I feel perfectly fine. I think everything works out, everything happens for a reason. So if you're connected with that feeling when something's right and when you have to continue with something, then my advice would be to continue with it, to carry on, and then all external things and other things that have to happen will be fine, and you'll actually say to yourself, that's really strange, I stayed up all night, but yet the next day I just got up for work and I was absolutely fine. In fact, I felt really energized and brilliant because you went with the flow of energy, you know, rather than trying to go against it. And I think that's kind of the rule of thumb with people, that they try and control things too much because of the system and how they should do things. And if things come up in your life naturally and you know, your logical brain is telling you that it's not really going to fit in with the schedule, just ignore it and just go with the flow, and then you'll find that it just kind of works out really well. It all, you know, everything happens for a reason, I guess. That's kind of what you know, that's the thought that springs to mind. But listen, guys, we're kind of coming up to the hour now, so we're going to have to sort of wrap things up. And just to sort of come to an end, I just like to go around and speak to people and sort of get their final thoughts on everything we've sort of talked about today on the show. So I would start with you, Dan. final thoughts on our discussion tonight.
Oops. I guess just my final thoughts are to let yourself wander and wonder about the world, and I think that's something that comes through when I see MICAH's work. Is that you kind of like sit there and you're like, for instance, the mind's eye, right? One of your one of your paintings, and in it has what to me is like the spark of the synapse, which is like also this kind of symbol of a sun that's like in the middle, but it also too has that fractal nature of like the firing off of stars and the galaxy, and just like the experience that I had when I told you when I was doing something mundane as getting something out of my eye, and then I stopped and like looked at my actual iris and noticed the geometric patterns of it, but also to notice this reflection of myself, and just got lost in that simple wonder of the now, of nature, of this moment of time that we have of life, and to dance and play with it. Since I'm more of a poet than I am a visual artist, I call them the songs of eternity, dancing to the heartbeat of the universe. And it's hard at times, but I think it's funny because it's one of those things that is both hard, but it's also easy. Once you do it just a little bit, you figure like, well, I mean, it's like nothing to just sit down and be with yourself. Um, like when I said when I lost those headphones, to kind of just like be in silence in my room and be alone with my thoughts and just follow every little crazy spark of an idea down the rabbit hole of the spiral nature of this fractal connection to my experiences, to different things, and letting it like render in my mind and see that play out within my own self, and then see it kind of get reflected back to me as doing this show, all these other side projects that I'm doing with Are You Serious and Mondo 2000, and it's just crazy that if how far it you could go with it. And I think this ride of life, um, it's about enjoying yourself, learning a little bit about yourself. The more you learn about yourself, the more I think the world kind of opens up to you, and you get those little moments of seeing how everything's in this elegant dance, that's into the songs of eternity, to the heartbeat of the universe. And yeah, that's about it for me.
So, MICAH, do you have any final thoughts on sort of everything we've talked about tonight?
Well, yeah, I have to agree with both of you. Like you're saying, to wander and wonder as we walk through this world, and sort of getting lost in the small things, like looking at your eyeball. I mean, I've definitely been there where you just kind of get lost for a moment, and enjoying the detail of your iris, or looking at the veins in a leaf when you hold it up to the sunlight, or maybe there's a little droplet of water on that leaf, and and you can zoom in a little bit and stare at the reflections and how it distorts everything that's being reflected in it. And I could go on and on and on. And that's a big part of what my artwork is about, is kind of looking at things under a different light, arranging them in maybe a different way. And also, to begin with, just putting things on the canvas that you wouldn't normally see in the first place, maybe because it is microscopic, or maybe because it's sort of beneath the surface. It could be like a single-celled radiolarian. If you're not familiar with those, just Google radiolarian and you'll be amazed. It's a microscopic organism in the ocean. It's at the bottom of the food chain, but it has this amazing geometric structure to it. And I didn't know about them until after I'd started painting, and this was probably 7 or so years ago. I should say painting in this style that I'm doing now, but and was looking for inspiration at the bookstore, and my wife, who's my girlfriend at the time, but came across this Ernest Haeckel book on radiolarians, and it just blew my mind. And I was just like, "What? Those are real things, And they're very geometric, detailed structures, and it's just amazing to think that all that can go into something that you couldn't even see with your naked eye." And that's, again, just one example. And I'm continually being amazed by what's out there. And that's one thing I love about what I'm doing, is that not only do I just enjoy painting, but I enjoy the other side of it, and just looking sort of the research, and sort of using the other side of the brain, and it helps me. It motivates me to look for inspirational things, not just for visual inspiration for my work, but just inspirational to life. And I just can go deeper and deeper into that. But enjoying those things as you walk through life, I just feel is really important, and it gives you a different perspective on life. It makes it more interesting, simply put, and it allows you to think beyond that reality that's just immediately in front of us, in the daily routine, like we've been talking about. Even if you are stuck in that daily routine, at least you can enjoy some of the small things along the way. So yeah, I'm glad when people look at my work and some of that comes across, because I just do my work, and like I said, sometimes I'm like the viewer and I can learn things from it myself. But when someone else can get something out of it like that, uh, it gives me great pleasure, and makes me feel like what I'm doing is actually worth something, and not just a selfish, indulgent thing that I do just because I like to do it. My goal is to go beyond just doing it because I enjoy it, and I feel like I'm good at it, and it feels like my calling or something like that. Ultimately, the point, as with I think it should be with anybody, and how they live their life, is how can I um, spread some of this to other people, and how can I um, try to make the world a little bit of a better or more interesting place, maybe open a few minds or whatnot. So thank you for noticing some of those things in my work.
Yeah, and I would say that, everything is kind of a remix. What we look at, the things that other people do, such as your artwork, MICAH, we can look at that, and then it will trigger something in us. Fellow artists, fellow people in general, we can then create something new. I don't really believe in this whole thing about plagiarizing. I mean, obviously, there's an element of, if somebody writes a story and you just go and rip the whole story off and then pass it off as your own thing, that's kind of a negative form of plagiarization. But I think, to be honest with you, every single artist that has ever lived in this reality has derived some inspiration from somebody or something. So you could argue that their creation is some form or some aspect of somebody else's creation. But what happens is, and this is the great thing, and this also highlights, this whole theme of connectivity that we've been talking about in reality, how everything's connected and how there's patterns in everything. these very clear similarities of connection, is that when you look at somebody else's artwork and you experience that empathetic resonance, you then create something that's new. You create a new creation because you've been inspired by somebody else. And obviously this is the beauty of art and being able to share our artwork with other people, is that we trigger something in somebody else. And obviously everything about the reality that we live in is art in itself. We derive inspiration from everything that we see and everything we experience. So in that respect, you could say that everybody's artwork and everything that anybody has ever done or created or invented even is some form of plagiarization. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing that people are constantly building and creating the new from things that they see in their reality and things that they derive some kind of inspiration from. So yeah, I would say that your artwork is great in that respect, because it not only is it, all artwork is something that we can derive inspiration from, but your artwork in particular, MICAH, is highlighting that very key aspect of how we're all connected and how everything in this reality is connected. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. And I know we had a bit of a technical issue at the beginning, last week and this week. So I'd also like to thank you for your patience in regards to all of that. But no, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and we will create a remix of this show. So, stay tuned for that, because it should be good. And thank you, Dan, as well for being here. Obviously, you weren't meant to get your headphones until today. It wasn't meant to be, even though you were trying to get them.
No, I just wanted to play with the silence, I guess. But yeah, thank you. It was nice to meet you, MICAH.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you both for having me. My pleasure.
And yeah, we at some point, if you'd be happy to, we'd like to have you on the show again. So it's not a case of, oh, you've only been on the show, you've been on the show once, you can't come on again. Always be nice to come back. So yeah, but yeah, like I said, stay tuned, and we'll create something magnificent out of this. And